Hi, my name is Rabbi Maurice Harris, and this is a short presentation on the Library of Sacred Jewish Texts. Of course, we have to start with the Torah. The Torah is also known as the Pentateuch, or the Five Books of Moses. It covers the books Genesis through Deuteronomy of the Hebrew Bible. And the Torah is the first of three collections of books that all together make up what is known as the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. The second section of books are called the Prophets, or Nevi'im in Hebrew. And the third section are called the Writings, or Ketuvim in Hebrew. And as you can see, these writings span almost 1,000 years worth of history in ancient Israel. Taken collectively, the Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings are referred to as the Written Torah in Jewish tradition. And we'll say more about that in a moment. Moving forward on the timeline, we get to the era of what is known as rabbinic literature, or early rabbinic literature. Basically, what you need to know is that about 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire destroyed ancient Israel and its temple in Jerusalem and exiled the great majority of the Jews from their land, setting up a very lengthy period of diaspora and exile for the Jewish people. And rabbis were the religious writers and thinkers and teachers who picked up the broken pieces of the religion and reassembled it. And they created a number of kinds of new sacred literature. So the Talmud is a body of discussions and debates and anecdotes, all having to do with various elements of Jewish practice, Jewish law, ethics, philosophical questions, and the Talmud frequently cites and quotes the Torah or other parts of the Hebrew Bible. It all refers back to the Hebrew Bible as its source of authority. Midrash is another kind of rabbinic writing that flourished during this period, and for now I'll just say that Midrash offers creative commentary, often organized on a basis of going verse by verse, line by line, through the texts of the Torah, the Prophets, or the Writings, and offering many different expansions or interpretations of what those words mean. If you're starting to get the impression that rabbinic tradition is very, very into lots of writing, and you're right. There were a number of rabbinic writings and teachings that did not end up getting canonized into the Talmud in particular, and they still were valued by the community and eventually got compiled as an additional set of writings known as the Tosefta. And that kind of closes out the rabbinic period. We've now pushed our way forward on the timeline to about 1,400 years ago, to the year 600 CE. And now that we've gotten into rabbinic literature, we are talking about what is referred to in Jewish tradition as the oral Torah. The reason for that name is that these rabbinic teachings that ended up written down in the Talmud, the Midrash, and so forth, they all began as oral teachings. Now we're going to move forward into the Middle Ages, the medieval period. One pattern you'll notice is that in each era of history, the rabbis of the moment want to offer their own fresh commentary and interpretation on the written Torah, on the foundation texts. And in some ways, by doing this, they kind of bypass all of the Jewish literature that stands between their era and the earliest written Torah texts. Although, of course, they are always factoring in those other bits of Jewish religious teaching in their thinking. So Medieval writers wrote line-by-line commentaries on the books of the Hebrew Bible, and that literature is found in Hebrew books that are often called mikraot gedolot, and this kind of writing is called parshanut in Hebrew. There were also medieval commentaries and discussions about the writings in the Talmud and the Midrash, and let's show a couple examples of these kinds of writings. If we look at the box that says Rashi and Tosafot, these were just examples of some of the more famous medieval figures who wrote lengthy commentaries and explanations of difficult subjects in the Talmud. Rashi lived during the 1000s in France, and the Tosafot were made up of his grandsons and some of their contemporaries, and they're all engaged in discussion and debate with each other and with elements of the Talmud. As you can imagine, all of this literature, this rabbinic literature, and these debates and discussions of Jewish law got pretty unwieldy and were pretty hard to master unless you were a person who had the means to study all day and all night. And things got to a point in the medieval period where a lot of leaders of Jewish communities throughout the diaspora were no longer sure what the proper practice was for the religion. They would hear about how a particular question was debated, but they wouldn't be sure how that debate had resolved or which majority opinion had defined the law and practice for the Jewish community. And as a result of this confusion, several very learned rabbis of the period decided to create basically rule books or simplified books of legal codes, catalogs of Jewish law for the common Jew. And what these basically did was they, instead of providing you the blow-by-blow of every discussion and debate that you might find in the Talmud, they just gave you the final answer. Now, of course, there wasn't always a clear final answer, so the authors of these codes had an opportunity to assert their own opinions and give them the weight of being the final answer. But that's a topic for a deeper discussion. Let's continue on. The medieval period was a period of tremendous flourishing of many different kinds of new Jewish sacred writing. This is the period when Jewish mystical writing really takes off. The Zohar gets distributed widely in the 1200s, and then a few centuries later, the Kabbalist Isaac Luria's teachings start to get disseminated, and these teachings kind of travel through the entire Jewish world quickly and are exciting and give people a whole new way of experiencing spirituality and Jewish life. This is also a period where many Jews who were living in great urban centers, particularly at the height of the Islamic Empire's success, we're being exposed to waves of sophisticated Greek philosophy that Muslim civilization had preserved and nurtured, as well as new ideas about science and astronomy and mathematics and rationalism. And a number of learned rabbis during this period sought to harmonize the Torah and the Tanakh and all of traditional Jewish teaching with the science and philosophy of their times. And they generated a number of different books, often very controversial books, presenting a new kind of Jewish philosophy. This is also the period in history when we start to see the publication and widespread of a standard prayer book or siddur. Jews had been engaging in a prayer practice that shared a similar structure for many centuries, going back to the early rabbinic period, but there was a lot of local variation. And in the medieval period, a number of rabbis attempted to standardize the liturgy and send copies of this, their idea of a standard acceptable set of prayers, far and wide. And as you can imagine, this was not an easy task because the printing press had not yet been invented. Finally, this is the era where we start to get what's known as responsa literature. And this is just basically literature where some Jewish community has a dilemma and they ask a question by means of a letter. They ask a question of a famous rabbi, and the famous rabbi writes a response, hence it's called responsa, and the response often presents a new opinion on Jewish law and practice, and becomes part of the sacred literature of Jewish tradition. All right, let's go forward into what is the modern period. So in the modern period, we also get new forms of Jewish writing that, if you can follow that line at the top that goes all the way back to the Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible, new forms of literature that also kind of bypass everything that came before and want to take a crack at responding personally and directly to the materials in the Hebrew Bible. Two very different kinds of literature emerge from two very different parts of the Jewish world. Top box there in the blue represents the rise of Hasidic Judaism, which came into being and flourished in Eastern Europe in the 1700s and forward all the way to this time, actually. And in the Hasidic community, I'll say a bit more about in a moment, they developed their own unique commentaries and sermons, or homilies, on the contents of the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. Now, in Central and Western Europe, and to some degree in the United States, when the U.S. came on the scene, we see the emergence of modern, post-Enlightenment, liberal denominations of Judaism, like the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, etc. And these groups and their early rabbis and scholars so start to write commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, which include a lot of their modern philosophy. This is a period when another kind of Jewish literature that had begun in earlier eras takes a big leap forward. This is known as Musar literature. I'm not going to say much about it right now, but this is a kind of Jewish literature of ethical practice. It's a literature that involves people going through processes of in self-examination and considering their different personal character attributes and looking for ways to create greater balance in their lives and to become more ethical human beings. So that's all I'll say about Musar for now. Back into the world of Zohar and Kabbalah, Zohar and Kabbalah had become so complex that only elites were really able to have the time to dabble in it. And this really troubled the leaders of the Hasidic community. One of their major values to make Judaism accessible to poor and often illiterate Jews living in their part of the world. And so some of their teachers began using a very simplified version of the core mystical ideas found in Kabbalah and offering far more accessible. And a lot of these writings are very beautiful and are quite accessible to us, even in English translation. So in the modern era, over on the liberal end of things in the Jewish religious world, you start to see news at forming modern Jewish philosophies. People like Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig try to harmonize the teachings and values of their very ancient tradition with the best values that have emerged in Western tradition, offer a new understanding of where Jews fit in the world. And of course, the modern era continues the tradition of responsa, as we described before. All right, now I have slid all of the modern era literature over to the left of the screen, and we're going to move to our era, the contemporary era. So first and foremost, once again, we're going to get all kinds of contemporary commentaries, especially a flourishing of these commentaries in the liberal end of the Jewish community, commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, from many, many, many new perspectives. We also see a proliferation of new Jewish prayer books and Haggadahs, the books for Passover, coming from all kinds of attempts to harmonize and blend contemporary values and ancient teaching. A movement known as Jewish renewal grows in strength during this period and starts to produce what we might call neo-Hasidic mystical and spiritual writings, and to popularize Jewish meditative practices. Responsa, responsa, responsa. We're always going to have responsa. Responsa continues in the Orthodox world in our current era, often dealing with new issues brought up by technologies like medical technologies and questions around suffering and the end of life. And in the liberal community, some of the liberal denominations write responsa as well, although they don't follow the same philosophy of how they work with previous Jewish teachings as the Orthodox. This is also an era when Jewish studies departments start to grow and pop up in the academic world all over the United States, and you start to see a whole slew of Jewish academic scholarly writing about all the texts that have come before. And with the rebirth of the modern state of Israel and the revival of Hebrew as a living language, we get this proliferation of Israeli literature, much of it secular, but it references, often quite poetically, teachings from the Hebrew Bible and all these other bits of sacred literature. And finally, I'll just mention that in our internet era, we're kind of on the cusp of something really new, and I have no idea where it's going, but it's this idea of online interactive text platforms, opportunities for people to not only readily access all kinds of different commentaries and responses that are part of the traditional sacred literature from centuries past, all on one screen, but for people to add contemporary comment and discussion, and it may be a game changer in terms of how things move forward. But I'm going to close now, and thanks for listening, and I hope that this overview has been helpful.